everybody, this is Robbie with Robbie's Reptiles, and today I want to talk to you guys about a new method that I've been testing out for keeping my juveniles and adult crested geckos, and I'm happy to report it's been a wild success. So I had originally heard of this idea from Fireside Geckos, but after talking to a couple of breeders, it seems that Birdtopia was kind of the first one to come up with this. There's a type of divider that you can get that's made of this easy-to-cut plastic that's generally used in separating aquariums, I think. But the general gist is using this divider as a way to separate the gecko from the actual substrate. One of the main reasons why big-time crested gecko breeders don't have bioactive setups is the females will dig and lay their eggs in the soil. Then, if you did have a really, truly naturalistic bioactive enclosure, you would have to constantly be digging up the entire enclosure to find the eggs that she's hiding. Because they're big, heavy glass enclosures, you can't pick them up and try to look at where the eggs are. So you really would have to just dig up the entire enclosure, and anyone that with a bioactive setup for a female right now can vouch in the comments. It can be a hassle. And if you're trying to breed hundreds of these animals, it's a nightmare. So what's great about this method is that there's this aquarium mesh in between the substrate and the gecko. So then the gecko doesn't have the ability to hide their eggs deep in the soil somewhere. So they still lay their eggs in the lay box, but you can still get all the added benefits of having the isopods and the springtails eat the waste products from the geckos, which actually has led to me not having to really clean any of my enclosures in the past 6+ months. I'm sure 90% of you watching this video have heard of having a bioactive setup, but for those that don't know what bioactive setup means, it's essentially creating almost a small ecosystem. All animals create waste, such as poop, pee, gross stuff. The waste that's generated from the crested gecko is then consumed by detritivores, which is a fancy way of saying isopods and springtails. A lot of people will say that the true definition of bioactive has to have real plants. I don't really care about that part, but you get the point. There's the other side of the hobby that are breeding on a larger scale, like me, having hundreds of crested geckos. We have to approach it more from the business end and trying to think of what can I do to provide everything that this animal needs, but also not needlessly putting a ton of money into the enclosure and the decorations and everything when it may not truly be needed for that animal to thrive in captivity. I think this method that I've been testing for the past few months perfectly walks that line, and I think actually has a lot more benefits than doing one or the other, such as not having to clean paper towel, not needlessly spending money on paper towel, reducing waste from paper towels. The only real maintenance required for my juvenile and adult tubs is cleaning off the sides if the geckos decide to finger paint a little bit. But even then, if you have a really strong springtail colony inside of each enclosure, they'll often do a lot of the work for you, cleaning the walls and the decorations. Now let's go ahead and show you what you're going to need in order to replicate this and how to set it up yourself. So when you're setting these up, what I do is I try to put 1 to 2 inches of organic soil. Specifically, I'm using this brand. I'm not sure where you could get it. You don't want to use something like coconut fiber or any of that cocoa core stuff. Shout out to Dirt Daddy for helping me with that. It's just going to lead to being really moldy and smelly. There's no nutrients in the cocoa core and the cocoa fiber. What you want is really rich in nutrient soil that pretty much just smells like manure, because the isopods not only eat the waste from the crested geckos, but they also just eat the soil and dead leaves. Then you're going to add in your isopods and springtails, then cover that in leaf litter. Fun fact, isopods are considered a crustacean. They're close relatives of shrimp, and they actually don't breathe normally. They don't have the same sort of breathing apparatus that most insects do. They actually have gills. So isopods need water in order to breathe. They will die if it gets dry. So one thing that you need to have in these tubs is a hydration station, which is essentially just wet sphagnum moss. So what I try to do is keep the lay boxes on top of the hydration station. This is not only going to provide a hiding spot for the isopods from the crested gecko, but this is going to be mainly where they'll hang out so that they can hydrate their gills and be able to breathe. However, the males don't have lay boxes, so you can either choose to give them lay boxes or take the extra steps to make sure that the sphagnum moss is always wet. I keep the hydration station in the front of the enclosure just so I can easily open it and check if the moss is damp, and if it isn't, then I give it a quick spray whenever I'm doing my general crested gecko care. Make sure to add in a lot of dead leaves and leaf litter. This is going to be a secondary food source for your isopods, but more importantly, your crested gecko is probably going to eat a couple, so having the leaf litter is going to provide them a much needed hiding spot from your gecko. Then you add the divider and you're good to go. You won't really need to worry about cleaning the top of the divider. I even tested out just having the gecko on the soil, leaf litter, and divider with no springtails and isopods, and I had them live on it for about 2 weeks, and then I added in the springtails and the isopods after the gecko had spilled food all over the divider, pooped on the divider, everything like that. And within a week, the divider was spotless. So you won't need to worry about cleaning the divider pretty much ever as long as you have a thriving colony of isopods and springtails in the enclosure. They'll do all the cleaning for you. So what I've elected to do for all of my bioactive tubs is I use a local species. So a lot of these have powder blues or Armadillidium vulgare, which is just the pill bug, because I figured if they're already naturally occurring here, they do well with the environment and the temperatures and the humidity that's already in the area. So that's what I use here. Another benefit of using a species that's already local to where you are, when the day comes that you do need to change out the substrate in your tubs, you're not going to have as big of a concern as introducing an invasive species to your area. A lot of different isopod species that we can have in the hobby, you need to be very careful to make sure that you don't introduce into the wild because they could become an invasive species. While isopods are relatively fragile and I don't see rubber duckies ever becoming invasive in America, you don't want to run the risk and you just don't want to introduce unnatural animals into an unnatural environment for them, which is why about 95% of my enclosures all either have powder blues or powder oranges, which are the same species, or they have vulgare, the common pillbug. However, I have also tried on a couple of different enclosures a variety of different isopod species to better recommend to you guys which species are a good cleanup crew in this specific circumstance. A handful of species that I've found work really well in this situation are the vulgare, the powder blues and oranges, zebras, pandas, Porcelio scaber, and even Cubaris marina all do pretty well in these tubs. In terms of springtails, I found that the pink springtails, which aren't actually really pink, and any sort of common springtail work pretty well in these environments, and I've been able to have springtails thrive in any of the enclosures I put them in. As long as there's a proper hydration station, the springtails and the isopods should do really well in this environment. Luckily, a lot of the cheaper species of isopods are cheap for good reason because they're incredibly easy to reproduce and easy to care for. So you can pretty much find them anywhere. If you guys would like to help support me though, I do have a lot of cultures available that I have for sale, but if I inevitably run out of stock, they are so common to find, you can pretty much pick them up at any reptile show or anywhere online. You could have a couple of bins in the corner of your facility that are constantly reproducing a ton of these isopods. So if any of your geckos inevitably eat some of them, or the isopods just fail to thrive, maybe it got a little bit too dry one day, you can always have some isopod colonies in the corner of your facility or something that you can constantly be breeding them to replenish your supply in each of your bioactive enclosures. And if you ever have too many in your breeder bins, you could always feed off the extra to some of your baby crested geckos. Apparently isopods are really high in calcium, so they're a good supplemental feeder as well if you end up having too many. I personally wouldn't recommend dairy cows. What I've noticed are the dairy cows are incredibly protein hungry. If there's ever been any hatchlings that fail to thrive, I'll feed them to the dairy cows, and within about 10 minutes, all that's left is bones. So I wouldn't recommend keeping dairy cows in these tubs with the geckos. I'm sure it could be fine, but I didn't want to test it because I fear that they'll start nibbling on your geckos while they're sleeping or something like that, and it's best to just try to avoid anything like that. In the description below, you're going to be able to find all the materials that you need in order to recreate these setups. The link down below will have the best price that I found for this material in the highest amount that I could find. This is something that you can get at like Home Depot and Lowe's, but I don't recommend it. A lot of my enclosures do have this, specifically my juvenile enclosures. This material is much better. It's a lot easier to cut and work with. It's more flexible too. So your ground doesn't have to be perfectly level, or if it inevitably isn't level, it's not going to be that big of a deal. The material can flex. What I also really like is that it segments together kind of like this. And some of our enclosures, with the leftover material we had from cutting, we actually just kind of zip tied it all together, and we were able to get another like 10 enclosures out of pretty much wasted material. This side of the material is perfectly comfortable. I haven't had any geckos seem to have any sort of issues with this material. So always have this flatter side up. Don't have this more sharp edge side up. Always keep it this side up. Now, this still is going to require some general maintenance in terms of cleaning up the sides of the walls if your gecko decides to finger paint, as well as scrubbing the decorations and branches or pool noodles that your gecko is going to inevitably climb and poop on. Switching to this style of tubs has been incredible, not only saving me money in the long run for not constantly needing to buy paper towels, but it's cut down so much on time. If you are someone with only 25 tubs that you're trying to fill, this isn't going to be too expensive. But what's great about this material being on Amazon and next day or 2-day delivery, you don't have to do a complete switch all in one day or an all in one session. You can add on as much as you like as you need. Now, some words of advice before you go out and buy all the materials that you need and start converting all of your breeder tubs. Make sure that you do not overspray. When I first converted all of these over to the soil substrate, I made a big mistake in overspraying all of them. And so it would be really humid in here, and I loved it, and all the geckos loved it. But the problem was if you overspray, then you are asking for fungus gnats. And what fungus gnats are, they're not harmful to the animal or even you, or to the isopods or the springtails. They're just this really annoying little gnat that, you know, when you like swat at a fly, it flies away. Fungus gnats are not afraid. Fungus gnats will not move when you swipe at them. They will stay on the soil, and every time you open up the enclosure, they fly up and they'll go straight for your nostrils, your ears, and your eyes. They're super annoying, and they're some of the worst pests in the isopod hobby. Now, because I first got into isopods only recently, I had to learn how to deal with them. And the best way to deal with fungus gnats is to do your best to prevent them by any means necessary. Do not overspray. Now, there's going to be some comments saying to add a drainage layer, and that very well may help against the fungus gnat problem. The reason I didn't do drainage layers in all of my setups was I wanted to preserve as much vertical space for the geckos as I could. Because already doing this, you're already getting rid of about 1 to 2 inches of height for your gecko to be climbing in. So I didn't add a drainage layer for that reason. Now, we did have a problem with fungus gnats for a while, but we were able to overcome it by drying them out. So we would spray super lightly, but we would spray more often so the geckos still got the necessary humidity and hydration, but it wasn't enough to actually dampen the soil at all. And so within a couple of weeks, all of the fungus gnat larvae died, and there were no more fungus gnat issues. We still have a couple because they're pretty much impossible to get rid of, and they are mainly just in the isopod bins. But so far, I haven't found any more in any of our gecko bins. You now know how to deal with it. If you find some fungus gnats, now you know that you're overspraying, and it's best to dry out the soil as best as you can. Now, you could do real plants if you want, although I don't think they would do very well in a tub kind of like this. I just opt for using my fake plants because I can clean them out as needed and replace them. You'll probably also notice that some of the enclosures have what seem to be floating pool noodles. What I've actually done is I just used some stainless steel screws that won't rust, and I've screwed the giant pool noodles into the enclosure so that they can kind of be floating, still providing somewhere to climb and somewhere to hide, and then I'll usually have it on kind of both sides of the walls. Well, I hope you guys found this helpful. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. Make sure to like, subscribe, all the YouTube mumbo jumbo, and I'll see you guys in the next video.